Security templates. In this nugget, we discuss security templates, and boy, these can really save us a lot of time in configuring our systems where we might otherwise have to make manual changes. And also, it helps to isolate our edits so that we don't have to do individual policies at once. Now, well, this does depend upon policies, however, and so we'll start off with a little bit of a discussion about how Active Directory works with things like organizational units, and then we'll talk a little bit more also about how policies work as well. Because the security templates that we're going to create here, we're going to import in the next nugget using our policies. Then we'll take a look at the template INF files themselves. There are several that are already included by default, and it's important to know what each one of them does, what each one of them is for, and so forth. Then we'll take a look at the Security Configuration and Analysis MMC console, which we can work in conjunction with these INF files to see how far in or out of compliance our local systems are with comparison to the templates. And then we'll take a look at how to save a database of settings, as well as how to export those into an INF file. Well, when it comes to securing your Windows systems, you want to try to do it with the least amount of work possible, because quite frankly, the more secure you make a system, the more difficult it is to manage and maintain. And in today's environment, boy, you have to have some modicum of security, and in most organizations, you have to have a lot of security. So let's go ahead and take a look at, first of all, at some Active Directory issues that will help us with this. If we go to Administrative Tools on the Start menu and then go to Active Directory Users and Computers, which again is kind of the home base for managing much of Active Directory, especially in relation to our accounts, organizational units, computer accounts, group accounts, user accounts, that kind of thing. Then we see that I've got a pretty plain setup here for NuggetLab.com. I haven't even created any organizational units. I've just got a couple of computers here. There's an XP computer. There's another Windows Server 2003 member server. And I've got 2 domain controllers here now. Now, what we're going to be working with here is something called security templates, and we're going to talk about the application of those and how you implement them. And it's going to really help that we have Active Directory and group policy, which we haven't discussed yet in this nugget. And although we don't have a full treatment of group policy, I will show you what you need to have in order to do things like deploying these templates, which are applicable for your security settings. So in order to do this, let's first of all just create another organizational unit. And an organizational unit is kind of like a container that contains additional items such as other accounts. Again, accounts like users, groups, computer accounts, and you can also do things like assign group policies to them. So we're going to use it to kind of be a Tupperware container of different things, except for different than Tupperware. You don't actually burp an organizational unit, but we'll go ahead and create an OU here, and we'll right-click and choose New Organizational Unit by right-clicking on NuggetLab.com. And once we click on that, we'll just name this whatever we want it to be. Let's say in our current purpose, we want to create an organizational unit for desktops. Okay, just going to create an organizational unit for desktop computers. And right up here where I have my client 01, I want to move that into desktops. So I could right-click like I would have done in Windows 2000, choose Move, then browse for the appropriate location here, and then click OK. I'm going to cancel that for now, though, because you might not be aware of this, but now in Windows Server 2003, oops, if I can just click on something, then now we can click and drag things around, where we couldn't have done that before. So, handy little thing there. Now we have that item in the desktops. Now I'm going to create another one here as well. It's going to be a new, again, organizational unit after right-clicking on NuggetLab.com. And I'm going to call this one servers. Now, of course, in a larger organization, you'll probably break that into other sub-OUs, like servers. And you might have SQL servers, mail servers, web servers, and all different kinds of things underneath that. And you don't do that just because it's kind of fun to create little categories. You do it because each one of those categories might have different kinds of security settings or different group policy objects on them. And I've mentioned group policy a couple of times now. If we're not familiar with it yet, group policy is something that I can configure that will establish just about every operating system parameter on a given computer or for a given user. Everything from the user's experience and the user interface to computer security settings and so forth. And I might do a similar thing for things like desktops here, where I would create laptops and normal desktops, and maybe other kinds of ways of breaking out the desktop machines. And then the third other important category I have here under NuggetLab.com, of course, is the domain controllers. And they already have a group policy object that applies to them. Now, before we move too much further on, let's just go ahead and address what policies are already in place. Yeah, there's already a couple of policies here that you might not be aware of. First of all, on the domain itself, if I right-click on it and choose Properties, and then go to the tab that says Group Policy, we see the default domain policy. Now, you might be seeing other interfaces to manage group policy. This would be true if you've installed the Group Policy Management Console, which is a free download from Microsoft, in which a lot of Microsoft documents reference, and which you should probably become familiar with if you use policies very much. But in any case, we'll just use the default thing that comes with Windows, and you'll select this default domain policy, and if you want to edit it, you simply click on Edit, and it brings open the Group Policy Object Editor, and there's over 600 settings within these six little folder things here, so we're not going to address all of those today, but we will address some of those a little bit later on as we go. So that's the one thing that gets applied to all your machines, and it flows downward, so it applies to everything within this domain. So it applies to domain controllers, to your desktops, your servers, and any other organizational units I create underneath there. And then for the domain controllers, it also adds an additional policy, so that if I right-click here and choose Properties and go to Group Policy tab, then we see there's a default domain controllers policy, and once again, there's several other policies there that will just apply to the domain controllers, and since they're down the hierarchy, they apply to just the domain controller's organizational unit, then they do not apply to any of these other organizational units or anything else I create down here. Now let's right-click on Domain Controllers and choose Properties and go back to that Group Policy tab and just edit this. And we're just here because we're not going to make any changes here. We're just here because we want to take a look at the available policies under Windows Settings, Security Settings. And we see a whole bunch of different stuff down here. Now, under Account Policies, for example, we see the password policy. And this is normally going to be defined on a domain level, but we're at the Domain Controllers policy. That's all right. All we want to really see here is what's available in terms of the password history, how long the password is good for, what its maximum password age is, what the minimum length of the password, whether it has to be complexity requirements, and all those kinds of things. So that gives you an idea of what's in the password policy. We also have an account lockout policy so that if someone enters in the wrong password a certain number of times, it'll lock out their account, and then it specifies how long that account will be locked out. So whether they can just sit there and twiddle their thumbs and go get a cup of coffee, or whether they have to call the help desk to have somebody unlock their account. So that's what the account policies are under here. Then we go to the local policies, and we see several other things in terms of the auditing. You can audit, for example, object access, so that you can see who's been accessing files. You can also see audit privilege use, so you can see if administrative privilege has been used for something. You can audit whenever people log on, all that kind of stuff. User rights to be able to do certain things, whether or not they can add workstations to a domain. Notice that authenticated users can. In fact, all authenticated users can add up to 10 computer accounts to the domain, and after that they're stopped from entering any more unless they're administrators. And then we have other things under security options down here. We can have specify whether or not they can access the CD-ROM unless they're locally logged on. We can do a whole bunch of different things like this, and I'm just showing you where some of these items are. These are the things that we'll be looking at in more detail shortly. You can specify how long the event log is, how long it's going to be retained, when it's overwritten. All this kind of stuff is contained underneath these security settings. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, okay, James, that's pretty cool. Policies are great, but I thought we were talking about templates in this nugget. Aren't we supposed to be doing something about security templates or security templates and analysis or something like that? Well, actually, we are, and all the stuff that we just looked at relates very strongly to that. And let me show you why. You're going to do security templates and analysis, and you're going to do that by creating your own console, because there is not a console on the administrative tools. So you go to a command line or a run command here, like I am right now, and you simply type in MMC for Microsoft Management Console, and then you can expand this open and then go to File, and then Add Remove Snap-in to add in the snap-ins that are not there by default on the Administrative Tools Start menu. So we'll click Add, and we'll go to Security Templates right here. And I'll just double click and that automatically adds it in. And then Security Configuration and Analysis, if I can double click, there we go. And that adds that in, or you can use the add button there. And then we click OK here, and then I'm going to expand this out now. And this is where we're going to see some interesting similarities to what we were just looking at. For example, here are my security templates. So I'm just going to pick one. I'm going to explain what these are a little bit later on. But as I pick on this one, for example, notice that it looks kind of similar. Account policies. Hey, didn't we just look at this stuff? Oh, password policies, account lockout. Yeah, we just saw all of this stuff. Local policies, user rights. Yeah, this is it. You see, all these templates do, and our main purpose for using these templates, is that we want to take one of these templates and apply it to a certain organizational unit in most cases, and then have it overwrite what settings are already there. And that might help to prevent me from having to go to individual machines and entering in the settings manually. It also helps to set up an interesting hierarchy where I can use multiple templates to get the effect that I want. Now, first of all, let me just go ahead and shrink this back up again. Now, let me explain, and I'm not going to go from top to bottom here. I'm going to start in a separate order. Let me explain what each one of these templates is for, what its purpose is. If I go to Setup Security here, this is the default setup that Windows Server 2003 uses to configure a server. So when I run installation, and I run WinNT or WinNT32 to install Windows Server 2003, it uses any of the policy items, any of the security settings that are in this policy. And these actually, by the way, are only INF files that are within this location, Windows Security and then Templates. And you can actually crack these open and look at them. Windows, and then we'll go to Security. And then we'll go to those templates themselves. We see here they all actually are. Here's the setup security that I was just focused on right now in the console. If I crack that open, notice that it is just a notepad file that it uses, and it gives me all different kinds of things in this. So for example, it tells me all the registry key settings to use, all the security settings to put on the registry keys. It tells me all the file system keys, and there's some other ones down here. So for example, there it is, some various file locations and the security settings that those are supposed to have. So basically, this gives me all the default settings for all the files, all the system files that we have on Windows System 32 and all that kind of stuff. And it tells me also what services start up by default. And that's what good this does for us. These templates will help to identify all those kinds of things. So when I first set up Windows Server 2003 on this server, these are the settings that it used, whatever was in the setup security thing. And if we double click on registry, then that's just another way of looking at it. This is the GUI interpretation of what we saw in the INF file just a moment ago. And if I double click on that, then it says to replace the existing permissions on the key, and it shows the security settings that are actually on that specific key. By the way, you might be wondering what this is. I'll just explain this. It's kind of something you'll see in a lot of different topics that you might look at. This is just what we have. Is the question mark that by this little guy here, account unknown, and then it's followed by the something or another there. This is what we call a bare SID. It's not an official term. It's kind of a colloquial term that a lot of administrators use for a SID that cannot be correlated with an actual account. And in this case, it's the power user's account. Can you think of why we can't see this account right now, or why it doesn't say power users? The reason is that when you promote a machine to a domain controller, it no longer uses power users anymore. So that really does not actually exist, and yet the security descriptor here is left behind on this access control list. So that's why it's a bare SID, because it can't resolve power users since we don't actually even have it anymore on a domain controller. Anyway, so this gives us the security settings for the registry keys. Here's the file system keys, again, the GUI interpretation of what we saw in the INF, and so forth. Now then, what good is all of this to us? Well, it's really not any good to us at all right now, and we're really a little bit premature in going to security templates. So first, let me point out what we'll do with this security configuration and analysis. What I want to do in most cases is I want to use a database here to compare the local system against the security settings that appear here under security templates. I want to, in other words, take this local domain controller, and I want to see maybe how it compares to the domain controller security template that we have here under Windows Security and Templates. So in order to do that, I'll right-click on Security Configuration and Analysis, and if I have an existing database, I can just choose Open Database or Open. And if I don't have a database yet, then I need to create a new one. Then I choose New Database, right? See, it's got to be in here somewhere. No. Actually, there isn't any. You still choose Open Database, which is just a little counterintuitive, I guess, for my thinking anyway. And then you enter in a name for it. And I'll just call it NLab Secure here, for example, and click on Open. And then we come to these templates again. Now, before I move too much further, I think it's a good time now to explain what each one of these templates are for. And I'll just use this interface that we're in right now to take a look at each one of these security templates. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this setup security just gives you the default setup instructions for a Windows Server 2003 installation. By the way, for other operating systems, such as Windows XP and Windows 2000, they also have their INF files on their local systems that will be applied for their setup. Now, within setup security, there are two ways of applying settings. For upgraded machines, they'll get one set of settings, and for clean installs, they'll get a different set of settings. And then once I upgrade this machine to a domain controller, it also adds to the setupsecurity.inf settings the dcsecurity.inf settings. Now, any settings that were in setup security will persist and be concatenated with or added to what we have now with DC security. The exception to that is if there were settings in DC security that were not configured at all in setup security, then of course they will now apply in addition to our existing settings. And if there are any settings that are in conflict with setup-security.inf. These new settings in DC security will override those settings, and that's the default behavior for templates when you concatenate them. Now, if I want to kick up security a notch, I'll go to this securedc.inf file here, and what that's going to do is it's still going to be pretty compatible with my applications and functions on the domain controller, but it's going to be more stringent in terms of my account policies, my auditing policies, and my security options. Also, it's going to increase some restrictions for LAN manager systems, which is an older method of Microsoft networking, which was insecure, and it's going to increase restrictions for anonymous users. Now, if I want to go to the highest possible level of security for my domain controllers with a pre-configured template, I'd have to go to HiSecDC.inf. What this is going to do is instead of just requesting digitally signed communications and encrypted secure channel communications as the securedc.inf file would do, this one will require it instead of just requesting it. So you have to have that. That will help to ensure that we have both parties in to communicate with this domain controller, that they really are who they say they are. That's what digitally signing is. It proves that I am who I say I am. And encryption, of course, obfuscates the contents of a communique so that nobody can intercept it and decrypt it and figure out what's going on with it and interpret the contents. Now, other things that this does is it's also going to remove all members from the power users group. It's going to disable additional services as well that you don't absolutely have to have in order to run a domain controller. Now then, for my workstations, we might have to go to something called a compatws.inf, and where is that? Here it is, compatws.inf. What this is going to do is it's going to allow me to run applications on my workstations that my users might not otherwise be able to run. You see, by default, only when members of the local users group run an application, they can only run apps that have the Designed for Windows logo program for software little stamp on them. And if an application is not stamped as the Windows logoed program for the software there, then in order to make a user run it, they'd have to be added to the Power Users group. Wow. Well, Power Users does a lot of things. I mean, a Power User can create a security group, add members to it, apply permissions to certain things, do all kinds of insecure things for untrusted users. So we wouldn't want to do that. Instead, what we could do is to use this compatws.inf file, and what that's going to do is it's going to loosen certain file and registry permissions for the users group, and that way they're still going to be able to run some of those more legacy applications, some of those older applications that aren't logoed, and without being able to add them to the Power Users group. Now, one thing you want to be sure that you never accidentally do here is to apply compatws to a domain controller. So don't ever apply to domain controllers organizationally. You'll see how we can apply these to OUs a little bit later on here. So don't do anything like that, because that will so significantly weaken a domain controller that it will be very easily exploited. Now, if you want to kick up the security notch for your workstation, you can go to this securews.inf, and that's going to be very similar to, with a lot of its settings, to the securedc.inf template for domain controllers. So it's pretty much still going to be pretty compatible with most functions and applications, but it is going to have restrictions on the LAN manager. It's going to digitally sign communications requiring greater anonymous user restrictions and things of this nature. Now, of course, for the highest level of pre-configured template security for your workstations, you can go to HiSecWS, and this is going to do things like increase security for NT LAN Manager. It's going to remove all members of the Power Users group, and it's going to make only the Domain Admins group and the local administrator account the only members of the local administrators group. And then we have two additional templates we can work with, the Internet Explorer Security Access Control List settings, which of course adjusts certain security permissions within Internet Explorer, and then rootsec.inf, which defines the security permissions at the root of a drive and then passes them down through inheritance. And that might be useful if someone is messed up with either the Internet Explorer or the hard drive permissions. Now, what I'm going to do is compare this local domain controller to the securedc.inf template file to see how well we are or are not in compliance with the secure domain controller template. So I select that one, and then it appears down here, of course, in the file name. Then I could clear this database before importing. And what this means is that if I have used the same database previously, and I used a different template in the past, then what's going to happen is it's actually going to concatenate or add that template to whatever I'm selecting right now and give me a result of both templates in the resulting interface. That might be useful in more complicated scenarios where I'm trying to see the result of multiple templates applied at once. In my current situation, I just want to have a very clear picture of how it applies to only this template, so I will clear this database before importing it. In reality, in this case, it wouldn't matter much anyway, because I've never used an additional template in the past. But I'll just go ahead and click on Open now. And then we'll see that it now gives me the opportunity to analyze this computer by right-clicking here, and then choosing Analyze Computer Now. Before, this was dimmed out before I had a database all configured, and before I had my template working here. So I'll analyze the computer now. It gives me an output file for any potential errors that occur. And this doesn't mean that that log file will only appear if there are errors. It shows me if there's anything that was a mismatch, and we'll take a look at that after a while here. So we'll click OK, and we see that it's gone to work. And now it gives us in kind of a handy little GUI here the comparison between my local settings and the template setting. So now let's go ahead and take a look at some of the differences that we might see here. So if I go to Account Policies, then I want to see if this local domain controller has the appropriate password policies compared to that template, and I click on Password Policy, and whoa, that doesn't look so good. I got a bunch of red X's here. That's kind of the universal Microsoft symbol for you're in big trouble. So we see here that, oh, I don't have any password history because the local computer setting says it's not remembering any passwords. But the database setting says it's remembering 24 passwords. Ooh, boy, that's not in compliance. So the maximum password age of 0, minimum password age of 0, minimum password length of 0. Hey, what is this? What this is basically telling me is I don't have to have any password at all. I don't have to use any password complexity. This looks like it was probably maybe a lab system that was brought out of the lab and put into production, and someone forgot to actually turn all the settings on. So that doesn't look so good. Well, let's look at some other stuff we have here. Our account lockout threshold, right now the computer setting is 0 invalid logon attempts. The database setting says after 5 invalid logon attempts, it should lock out this account. So we're not in compliance with that one either. Kerberos looks okay, but you see, notice there are also some here that are not defined at all. The database setting doesn't care one way or the other. It doesn't say anything about any of these Kerberos things. And Kerberos tickets, by the way, are what you use to process logons with Windows 2000 and later systems. And each Kerberos ticket has a certain lifetime and expiration and stuff like that. Now let's go down here to local policies as well, what our audit policies are. Here, my local computer setting only wants to see if someone successfully logs on, whereas the database tracks success and failure. And again, you see all these different ones. I'm not going to go through every one of them, but we see that we're pretty out of whack here in terms of whether or not we comply with that security CINF template. Let's also discuss some of the other little symbols you might see here besides the universal alarm X symbol here. We have the green checkbox on a white field. That simply means that the policy is defined in the database and on the computer and the values match. So yeah, we're good okay on that one. Then we take a look at some other things. Let me go back up here to Kerberos policy. Actually, account lockout, there it is. Sometimes you might see a bracket question mark on a white field like this account lockout and this reset account lockout item. And that simply means that the policy isn't in the database, so therefore it was never analyzed. Or it could also mean that the user running the analysis didn't have the appropriate permissions necessary to access the policy on the computer. And then there are a couple of other items you might see as well, which I won't show you right now, but I'll also explain them to you. There's an exclamation point and a white circle, and that means that the policy is defined in the database using the template, but it doesn't even exist on the computer, so there's no comparison to make. And then there's the no flag item, which would be, again, I guess I can show you one of those. Yeah, just the stuff like this right here. There's no flag at all on the little symbol. And that means the policy is not defined in the database or on the computer, either one. Now, you can also make changes to this stuff. For example, under System Services down here, what if I want to change the way one of these services starts up? There's a good one here. IMAPI CD burning COM service. You see, maybe I don't want anyone to ever be able to burn CDs on a CD burner on a domain controller because it just presents too much of a security vulnerability where someone could take sensitive information, burn it to a CD, and walk off with it. So what I would want to do here then is I might want to change this in the database. What I would do is double click on this, define the policy in the database, leave it at disabled here, and then OK, which you can't really see down there, but I'll press enter, and that's the same as clicking OK here. And now that is configured. Now that does change it within the database, and there's a couple of different ways that I can now apply it to a local domain controller or to all domain controllers. Now then, having done that, if I want to take this setting plus all of the other settings, including our password policy stuff and all that other kind of stuff, and I want to apply that to this local domain controller, I can do that by right-clicking here and then just choosing Configure Computer Now. And then at that point, it would flood all of those settings that have been configured in the database directly onto this domain controller. Might have to be restarted for certain of those settings to take place, but in any case, at least the settings would then apply. No, I'm not going to actually do that because it's always a good idea to generate a rollback first, and I'll show you how to create a rollback in just a few minutes here using the secedit command. The rollback will allow me to go back to my previous settings in case something goes wrong with this configuration. Alright, now if I like the settings that I've configured there, where you can't burn with the CD-ROM and all that kind of stuff, and I want to save all of this, the initial temptation is to say, hey, I want to use this in another template of my own, another INF file. So I'll right-click here and choose Export Template, and then you'll give it some clever name and think that you can bring it back in to a policy or apply it some other way with this template INF file. Well, not so fast, because if I save it right now, none of the settings that I've configured will actually be in the template. This is a strange thing, and I have not seen this warned about in any Microsoft documentation, so pay attention because I think this is the only place you're going to find this out. What you got to do first is to right-click here, and then you have to save the database the way it is now. Now, the way this is, in my opinion, Microsoft should have grayed out this export template or dimmed it out, kind of like this view log file thing is. They should have dimmed that out so that you could not do that until you first save this. So you got to save it. That's what I just did. Now I can export the template, and now I can give it some clever name like, NLab, Secure DC, or something like that. Now I save it. Now it's going to contain all the settings that I've configured. And a big key to remember with this is any changes I make within this really only change the value in the database. They don't actually change the local computer. So keep that in mind. Let me show you another way to do this as well. If I go to Start, Administrative Tools, again, this applies to if I want to apply security settings, then I could go down here and I could find an item called Local Security Settings in the console that appears here. Now, it's not going to appear on this machine because it's a domain controller, but any member server or even any Windows XP computer, for example, will have a local security settings which has these exact same security settings, and you can just edit them locally that way. Now remember also I'd mentioned that when you perform this analysis there will be an output to a log file to determine any problems or any errors. It's actually not just errors, it shows you what matches and what doesn't match, and it will appear in the local My Documents Security and Logs location on the hard drive. And then here we have the nlab secure.log file which it put out for us, and if you want to just go ahead and quickly look for any of the problems that were there, do a Control F to do a find function here, and look for the word mismatch. And then it'll show you where the mismatch or the problems were. In other words, it's showing you the red X's here. And the red X here was the minimum password length, all these password problems that we saw a little bit earlier. In this nugget, we took a look at security templates, and we started off with a discussion of Active Directory. We had to look at organizational units and how their role takes place, how the role of the domain controller's organizational unit takes place within our policies. And we looked at some policies themselves, and those are important in security templates because we're going to be able to use template INF files to import them into various policies, which we'll see more specifically in the next nugget. Then we also discussed what these actual template INF files are, what their purpose is, and how they differ from one another. We also took a look at the securities configuration and analysis, which is an MMC console that you can use to compare an existing machine with a template and see how far in or out of compliance a local machine is. Now, of course, for a domain controller, that's going to include the actual policies in that domain controller. Now, let's take a look also at the database. That's what we'll use in security configuration and analysis. And the database that we generate out of that will have certain settings in it. We've got to be able to save those, remember, first. Got to save the settings in the database. Once you've done that, then you can save the INF files themselves, and then you can use them in policies like we'll see in our next nugget. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.